Today, let's start by talking about your freedoms and why they are under assault. So your freedoms are under assault from motivated thinkers on every side. You have a group of people who believe that because there are problems in your life or in their life, that they get to assault other people's rights, and they get to redistribute the product of your labor. They get to invade your rights on behalf of their own. And the most extreme version of this is the identity politics that has suddenly infused large portions of the left. It's actually generated a sort of response politics of identity politics on behalf of the right. But this basic logic suggests that because you are a member of a particular victimized group in American society, other people's rights don't matter the same way that your rights matter. And what this creates on the part of the left is the intersectional hierarchy. This idea that if you're a member of a more victimized group, you have more rights by nature than people who are members of less victimized groups, because we have to somehow rectify the imbalances of America's history. So on the intersectionality scale, for the left, it goes something like this in terms of the folks who are most victimized in American society. It goes LGBT folks, and then black folks, and then Hispanics, and then women, and then Asians, and then Jews, and then right here at the bottom, white folks. And this matters because for the left, this identity politics hierarchy decides how seriously we ought to take your views. If you are lower on the intersectional politics hierarchy, then we don't have to take your view particularly seriously. In fact, you should shut up and you should listen. You should acknowledge your privilege. If you are at the upper end of that echelon, then of course, you should be able to not only say whatever you want, but you should also be respected for what you have to say, no matter how stupid it is. And if your rights are violated and you're on the bottom end of that scale, well, that's just because that's the way the world has to work in order to fix the problems that we've had historically in the country. Well, to understand the current assault on individual rights that's taking place across the country, we first have to understand that there are two different visions of how rights work. There's the negative rights vision, and there's the positive rights vision. The negative rights vision suggests that rights come from God. You, as an individual human being, have rights that you would have in a state of nature, without a government presence, without any sort of overarching power. You would have these rights. You have the right to defend yourself. You have the right to your own property. You have the right to freedom of speech. You have the right to bear arms. All of these things exist in a state of nature because they allow you to protect yourselves and own what it is that you do. These are rights that come as a manifestation of you being an individual of worth, of you being made in God's image. Then there's the positive rights view of how rights work. And this is the idea that rights come from government. There are no rights outside of government. There's a big collective. And that collective gets to tell you what your rights are. And therefore, if that collective decides that your rights are not as important as somebody else's rights, then they can simply redistribute the rights. They can circumscribe the rights. They can prevent those rights from being evenly applied or available to everyone. The US Constitution is based on negative rights. The Constitution of South Africa, or the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, those are based on positive rights. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, by the way, suggests, the notorious RBG, she says the US Constitution is a worse constitution than the South African Constitution because she is a devotee of positive rights. This would be right to health care, right to education, right to housing. Now, the way you can tell the difference between a negative right and a positive right, just in practice, is whether a right that is articulated requires somebody else's labor or time in order to effectuate. So I have a right to bear arms. That doesn't require anything of you. I have a right to self-defense, freedom of speech. I have a right to my own property. These require nothing of you other than you don't get to invade that right. A right to housing, by contrast, suggests that I have to provide you housing. A right to health care suggests I have to provide you health care. And that if I am unwilling to provide you these things, then I have violated the social compact and I can be forced to at the point of gun. You can see how these differences between negative and positive rights are manifest in today's politics. And it's no surprise that the Constitution has come under attack from these positive rights advocates, largely springing from the left. Now, how do these positive rights intersect with the identity politics I was talking about early? Well, the left has basically suggested that positive rights are not to be equally applied. It's not that everybody has a right to housing or everybody has a right to health care. It's that everybody has a right to housing and everybody has a right to health care. And if we have to restrict somebody else's rights in order to guarantee that universal positive right, then we will pick the groups that have historically benefited from the American system, and we will penalize those groups. So identity politics is really a redistributionist way of thinking about how rights are supposed to be manifest in American politics. Here's how all of this plays out in terms of your rights. The Bill of Rights is filled with rights. These are all negative rights. All of the rights in the Bill of Rights, with possible exception of right to counsel, maybe, All of these are negative rights. They are rights that you have in a state of nature and that are not guaranteed to you by the government, except by the government guaranteeing nobody else can invade those rights. And all of those rights are currently under assault from a left that wishes to rewrite that social compact. Freedom of religion under the First Amendment obviously is being assaulted right now by folks who believe that rights are variable. And freedom of religion suggests that I get to practice my religion as I see fit, so long as I'm not harming you. But what the left does is they say, well, your definition of harm isn't broad enough. So if you run a business and you don't wish to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding, you are somehow invading my rights. Well, I'm not. In any sort of negative rights world, I'm obviously not invading your rights because I have no obligation to bake you a cake. It's my cake, it's my shop. I don't have a right to, you don't have a right to my cake. You don't have a right to my labor, you don't have a right to my time. But the left has decided that freedom of religion must be quashed, but specifically religions that have had historical dominance in the United States, which is one of the reasons that you see all of this focus on the part of social activists on the left focusing in on religious Christians and almost none focusing on religious Muslims, for example. If you go to a religious Muslim bakery, they also will probably tell you that they're not interested in baking a cake for your same-sex wedding. But you haven't seen any talk about that, specifically because Muslims in the United States rank higher on the intersectional scale than Christians do. Well, the same thing holds true when it comes to rights like freedom of speech and of the press. The right to freedom of speech only applies under certain circumstances according to the left, because some speech is harmful, some speech is violence. Hate speech must be banned. Now, nothing in the Constitution says any of this. Speech is speech, violence is violence. There is no such category under the Constitution, or really in thought, as hate speech. We all know that there's such a thing as hateful speech, but that's not the same thing as saying that you, a subjective human being, get to ban other people or use violence to stop other people from talking. Yet you see that the left has engaged in a sort of mob politics where they grin and laugh when people's rights are shut down. If I go to Berkeley, then you'll see riots, literal riots, if I go to Berkeley, because my speech is violence. When I went to Berkeley, requiring some 500 police officers, 600 police officers to protect the place, people outside were literally chanting, speech is violence, which of course it is not. But if the goal is to equate speech with violence, then as soon as speech is violence, we can shut down violence. Government has a role in preventing violence. So if my speech is violence or causes violence, then we can simply shut down my speech. This is ugly stuff. And you see, unfortunately, this mindset becoming quite prominent across the country. I'm not just talking about governmental attempts to shut down speech at this point. I'm talking about an attitude of free speech that actually allows us to have a fulsome conversation about the issues. You saw this manifest when it came to the Me Too movement. This idea that men had nothing to say about Me Too. Sit down and shut up, you're men, you don't know anything. Or abortion, sit down and shut up, you're men, you don't know anything. Well, we can't have a conversation if you're simply going to assume that I can't understand you because of dint of birth. I was born a man, not my fault. I mean, I'll say I'm pretty happy about it, but it doesn't actually mean that I can't have an opinion on matters that affect other groups more than they affect me. Because the entire basis of having any sort of republic is the idea that we can talk beyond those barriers, that we can have rational conversations with one another. Identity politics throws up a roadblock in the way of this. Identity politics prevents you from having these important conversations. The left is assaulting the right to bear arms, obviously. Now, the right to bear arms was specifically created and meant to protect you from tyranny. It wasn't meant for hunting. It wasn't meant for sport shooting. It was meant to protect you from tyranny and to prevent you from having your rights assaulted in your own home. The left has decided, however, that that's not really a threat, which leads to a really weird spectacle. The left proclaims that President Trump is Hitler or Stalin, but they want him to take all their guns, which is a very weird response to Hitler or Stalin. The fact is that if the left truly believed that Trump was all the things they say that he is, they would be very much in favor of the right to bear arms as a defense against the sort of tyranny that they specifically are afraid of. But the real truth is that the attempt to take away the right to bear arms is based on the idea that your individual rights can be quashed in the name of the collective, that there is a broader collective that has an interest in you not having a gun, and therefore your gun should be taken away, no matter how law-abiding you are, which is one of the weird things about gun control. Everybody, left, right, and center, agrees. We don't want people with severe mental illness having guns. We don't want people with criminal records having guns. We don't want people who are inherently dangerous having guns. It's only the left that suggests we want people who are fully law-abiding to have their guns taken away from them because somehow this is going to make society safer. which suggests perhaps there's an ulterior motive to the attempt to take away the right to bear arms, and that is to remove obstacles between the government's control of human life and your rights. Other elements of the Constitution that are being undermined right now, other rights that are being undermined. The most obvious case in the last several weeks, obviously, is due process of law. The British government violated the rights of colonists without due process of law on a regular basis. Now, all due process of law means is that there is a fair legal system that allows adjudication of your rights and defense of those rights. And due process of law requires that you be treated as an individual. Due process requires that your rights are yours. In other words, if you are an individual and you didn't do anything wrong, you don't get to be thrown in jail based on what group you're a part of. And yet we saw, actually, over the last several weeks, that the left has basically decided that this is to no longer apply based on your membership in particular groups. We saw this specifically with Brett Kavanaugh. When due process of law, the very concept of it went by the wayside. The most obvious example that I saw in terms of public discourse was this grand attempt by the nation's op-ed papers to print piece after piece from women who'd been sexually assaulted, claiming that their sexual assault meant that Brett Kavanaugh was guilty. Connie Chung wrote a piece like this for the Washington Post, in which she talked about how, as a 20-year-old woman, she was sexually assaulted by her doctor. And she said, "I believe Christine Blasey Ford because I was sexually assaulted when I was 20. Well, I'm curious, you, who are not Christine Blasey Ford, was sexually assaulted by a man who was not Brett Kavanaugh, and therefore Brett Kavanaugh assaulted Christine Blasey Ford. This does not follow. If we are going to start condemning people or removing due process of law or burden of proof or presumption of innocence simply on the basis of your identity, your genetic identity, it's very weird to see the same left that recognized that this was a bad thing when it came to race in the 1960s suddenly suggest that it is okay when it comes to sex in the 2010s. Due process of law is the fundamental heart of our civilization, and removing that on the basis of identity politics is dangerous stuff. Obviously, the most obvious example of a right being removed based on identity is the right to life. And this notion that you get to simply adjudicate based on your own subjective feelings about whether you want to have a baby, whether a baby is indeed a baby, is just a complete violation of logic and law and common sense. It makes no sense whatsoever. If you want to actually make a pro-choice argument, then make a pro-choice argument, but that argument cannot be based on a woman has better judgment about what constitutes life than a man, and that a society that tries to protect individual human lives has no stake in what happens to the unborn. That obviously is a bad argument. Unfortunately, all of these arguments have become quite commonplace in America right now, and that means all of these rights are in serious danger. And one of the reasons these rights are in serious danger, too, is because when you have a society that is focused only on rights and not at all on virtues, it turns out that there's a backlash. And this has been part of the problem. And this is a problem for people on the right. And I'm not even talking about people who are not really on the right, like the idiotic alt-right. I'm not talking about folks on the right who don't actually believe in conservative principles. I'm talking about the libertarian-minded right, folks like me. There's been a problem. We talk about rights all the time, and that's good, because we should talk about rights and how to defend them. But because we very rarely talk about the virtues that are necessary to preserve freedom and preserve a free people, we end up generating a backlash to the right itself. So, for example, the right is very pro-capitalism. Right? All of that is great. I'm a virulently free market individual. But in order for free markets to actually operate the way they are supposed to, you require a virtuous and decent people. You require people who are going to abide by certain basic social rules. You require people who have enough respect for each other that they're not trying to cheat each other at every turn, who have enough respect for each other and the social fabric, they're not trying to tear each other apart in the name of short-term gain. You need a virtuous people. Because otherwise what happens is that bad things happen in the name of capitalism, and then the left responds by saying, capitalism is no good, we need social control from the top. You see the same thing happen with regard to freedom of speech. I will defend anybody's freedom of speech, including from people who disagree with me, who threaten me, who are legitimately awful human beings. But if we are constantly using freedom of speech in the worst possible ways, you're going to see a backlash, an inevitable backlash on the part of people who have not thought about the relationship between rights and responsibilities and think that we ought to quash the right in order to make a better world. That's dangerous stuff. And so it's incumbent on all of us to become more virtuous in how we speak. And that's me too, right? I've failed at this. We all fail at this. But the question is, which direction are we moving? Can we make ourselves more virtuous? Can we have conversations with other people without assuming the worst motives and the worst intent? When it comes to the right to bear arms, are we going to be responsible about how we treat our weaponry? Are we going to be responsible in getting trained? Are we going to make sure that the guns are locked up? If you actually want to have good conversations while maintaining rights, then what you need is a people who are committed to a certain baseline of morality. Due process of law means thinking beyond our confirmation bias, requiring due process of law whether we like the person who is being attacked or whether we don't like the person who's being attacked. We actually have to think through each individual case. If we make ourselves better, then we deserve our rights. We have those rights whether we deserve them or not. And the solution to misuse of rights is not to quash the right. But if we actually wish to be a free people who preserve our own rights, then we have to be a more virtuous people. And that's the other half of the equation. Every right has corresponding duties. Not duties on somebody else's behalf. That's positive rights. Duties on your own behalf. You have a right to free speech. That means you have the obligation to think well and speak well. You have the right to property. That means that you ought to treat people responsibly and make moral decisions with that property. That doesn't mean we can take away your right, but if you want a functioning society, you need rights on the one hand and virtues on the other. And if they go hand in hand, then you have a functioning, beautiful country. That's, I think, what we all ought to be aiming for, right, left, and center.